Hi, my name is John Horgan. I'm a science journalist. I also teach at Stevens Institute of Technology, and I'm introducing some of my colleagues to the world and especially to prospective students. And with me today is one of my favorite people at Stevens. Kristyn, can you just briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I am Kristyn Karl. I am an assistant professor in the College of Arts and Letters, in political science, I should say. But we teach broadly across the social sciences, and I got my PhD from the University of Michigan. This is my 5th year at Stevens, and I teach a whole bunch of courses, and I'm sure John will kind of talk us through what I teach and what I do and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so first, why political science? How did you get interested in that? Why did you decide to make a career out of it?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially with what's going on in the world. A lot of people don't like politics right now, and I'd probably put myself in that category as well. So why political science? There's not really a simple answer to this one. The relatively short answer is that I was a first generation undergrad student, and when I went away to college, opened my eyes to a whole new world. My family was not all that political in the sort of explicit way where we talked about it or anything like that. And while I was at college, I majored in biopsychology and in government. I double majored. And for a long time, I lived these two very different lives, because in one, I was in a lab working with mice, and in the other, I was studying how people respond to politics. And it took me a while to figure out that there was a way for me to combine those two things. And that's what I've been able to do. And when I graduated undergrad, I bounced around a little. I spent time volunteering after Hurricane Katrina. I spent time in Washington, D.C. trying to figure out what exactly I wanted to do. And I ended up going back to graduate school for a PhD in political science. But the more kind of narrow focus of my research and of my work and even of my teaching is political psychology, which is a wonderful combination of being interested in political behavior, why people think what they think. And so the line that I always tell students when I start my politics courses is, truly, I'm not as interested in what you think as I am in why you think it. And so when we talk about a lot of political issues, I come at it from a perspective of, well, let's figure out how we ended up there, or political behaviors, or those sorts of things.
To what extent has your field been transformed by some of the tools that are available now, like computers and big data sets and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a big influence in political science. I was fortunate because of the program I went to at the University of Michigan. It was well known as a quantitative heavy course of study. We do a lot of econometric statistics, that sort of thing. And so my training is pretty quantitative. And, a lot of people are like, what does that mean? Essentially like a data science type of background. Now, there's a wide range, and when you say that phrase, everybody sort of specializes in their own methods and their own things, but political science as a field has moved pretty heavily in the direction of quantitative research. Now, that's not to say that we don't still have traditional scholars that use qualitative methods, that use a whole bunch of different methods, and I teach research design and methods at Stevens, so I get to tell students all about all of the options for how they can do research, but my focus in my research is pretty heavily quantitative.
Now, I just have to ask you, since I'm a journalist, I teach a seminar in science writing at Stevens. You also have some experience as a journalist, and you also teach a course in science communication. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, sure. So don't have direct experience as a journalist, but definitely my graduate training, I focused a bit on science communication, and one of my dissertation advisors is now at the National Science Foundation on a temporary sort of big position, and he focuses pretty heavily on the science of science communication. and how best we ought to communicate with the public given what we know about how our brains work. And so that was a nice little leg in for me because I'm so fascinated by how our brains work and that sort of approach to best practices for communication. So when I teach science communication at Stevens, we start from a whole bunch of basic principles about what we're all capable of taking in, how our attention spans work, those sorts of things. And then we build a framework for how we ought to communicate complex topics to the public. And so as I finished my science communication class today, I said, look, if you're looking to carry things forward into the future, I would advise you just to pull the grading criteria from this class and treat it like a framework for, am I doing this well or not? And they all sort of laughed. And I was like, no, I'm not kidding. I'm serious. And so
I might have to adopt that in my class. We're going through a pretty dramatic time. I mean, certainly I'm a lot older than you. And I was around in the 60s when Nixon was impeached. To what extent do current events influence what you teach? I'll start with that question, then I've got a follow-up.
Sure. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse to teach topics and to research topics that are usually pretty relevant. And so whether I'm talking about my research or my teaching, I'm talking about, for instance, right now, I'm analyzing data on coronavirus and emotional responses and how that interacts with your partisanship, right? And in terms of my teaching, one of the hardest things I've ever taught was the 2016 presidential election at Stevens. I teach a course called Campaigns and Elections that coincides, and it's taught every other fall. And so it's deliberately designed to coincide with US elections. And teaching live when many of the things that historically were true were not true, and you couldn't point back and say, really, it's not always like this. I mean, when you have younger students and they don't know history and they don't know, systems and mechanisms and all this stuff, and you're saying, honestly, we haven't had a candidate who doesn't use bought paid media like that, right? Like, you're using these examples and they're like, the world is different now. And so I think teaching while that was occurring was a really kind of eye-opening experience for me. I'm already thinking, well, I need to rework the assignments. I need to rework some of the things. Instead of, for me, for example, one way I'm going to update the class is I think I'm going to move away from a framework that covers a particular topic and foundation each week. So like it used to be the case that I would spend a good chunk of time on advertising and then on campaign strategy and we would move through those topics sort of sequentially. And I don't know that that's gonna fit the same way, especially the overwhelming influence of the media, for example, right? And the overwhelming influence of partisanship. I mean, some of those factors will have to just carry through the entire course.
So here's the related question. To what extent do you let students know where you are politically, what your opinions are when it comes to some of these great issues that we're debating?
Yeah. So before 2016, I was pretty firmly in the don't let them know camp and teach from an objective position. I am still heavily in that camp. However, I did make it clear in 2016, for example, we were watching, was it 16 or 18? I can't remember exactly because it's blurring together at the moment. But in 16, for example, I had, with Trump's comments and the Access Hollywood tape, right? There were things that became so outside the norm of what was socially acceptable, and that in fact they're harmful to certain populations. And I made it clear that I wouldn't shy away from saying that I thought something was wrong, and especially on some of these moral topics. And so, when we were watching the Kavanaugh hearings, for example, I gave students the option to weigh in on whether or not, because they were actually airing live during the class. And so I gave students the option of whether, I said, let's take a vote. And as long as it's above, 60, 70%, then we'll go with the class. And if not, I'll decide. And 95% of the class wanted to watch the hearings. And so that was an interesting sort of phenomenon where, again, it's current, it's happening live, but you can't really teach on those things without making some implications, making some claims. But I think if you talk to some of my students, they would probably say that I play it pretty close to the vest. So
Yeah, I think I'm emotionally incapable of playing it close to the vest. I kind of blurt things out in class. I think your approach is, it makes more sense, especially as things get so heated.
I mean,
Um,
I'll interrupt you only because it's easier for me, because honestly, genuinely my network of people I'm surrounded by is extremely politically diverse.
yeah.
And that's unique. And I know that as someone who studies politics, but I can tell you that I speak with and have family and friends who are on the very far right, and I have the same on the very far left. And so trying to navigate that has sort of made it easier for me to project that forward in the classroom setting. I think if I didn't have that, I think if everyone agreed with me in my kind of outside of academic interactions, I think I would struggle a lot more to sort of come at it with this close to the vest type of approach.
So here's, I guess this should be the final question. Your research takes you deeply into the psyche of American voters. The presumption of democracy is that people can be more or less rational in choosing their leaders and choosing policies. How confident are you that that presumption is accurate? And do you ever get depressed over the irrationality of the American people?
Big question. So where you started from, I would actually add like a little star caveat, which says the assumption of our democracy is that people can behave as if they're rational. And so one of the ways that we have done this as citizens and as voters historically is to rely on parties. You know, a lot of people right now really don't like, and I can use the word hate, or feel really strongly against either one of the parties, usually the one with which they don't align, right? Affective polarization, I mean, our emotional responses are really, really deep right now. We're villainizing the other side, that sort of thing. And yet, there still is a benefit to taking some of that cognitive demand of figuring all this out and handing it over to someone else. It's a shortcut. It's a way of saying, this is too much work for everyday citizens to do. And this is why we have people who are experts in different fields, right? And so if the argument is, you know, I have someone who does all the work on my car and they're an expert in that domain, I export that task to them, right? If I have people who think deeply about politics, you know, following the media is a job in and of itself. I get people asking me all the time, how do I know who to follow? How do I know what to listen to? And then I have this whole spiel about how difficult it is, sort of to explain to them that it really is our job to follow the media and to do it well and to be balanced and to check your sources and all of that. And they say, well, how is the everyday person supposed to do this when we have jobs and we have lives and we have other things that we are experts in, right? And I say, well, it was a lot easier when we had 3 news stations and no internet, and you know, the demands have changed. And I think recognizing that political parties bring a lot to the table, and in this moment, they may have pushed us a little too far into those identities, right? The polarization aspect, we may be too entrenched in those, but I still hold on to optimism that, you know, as historically we've seen, this is going to ebb and flow, and some of these attachments and some of the politicization of every single topic will diminish. I'm not one for making predictions, especially not on a recorded thing, but I do think we might be at the beginning of the swing against polarization. I think there's some good reason to point at the upcoming election and some of the trends we're seeing from within the Republican Party, for example, to suggest that there may be some self-censoring. There may be groups like the Lincoln Project and other organizations that are at least attempting to move in different directions.
I'm glad you said that. I think I need a little bit of optimism myself. I'm feeling kind of gloomy these days, and
Yeah.
especially heading toward this fall, toward, what is certainly one of the most, if not the most important presidential election of my lifetime. So,
Well, and let me add, I mean, as we get older, I think we hold a lot of hope in young people, right?
yeah.
And so when you look at generational change, there's still reason for hope. There's reason for unity. There's reason for people to be optimistic about what's capable. And in some ways, the backlash against parties as they currently exist, while I don't think they'll ever be successful in tearing apart the US system by any means, I do think that attitudes against this hyperpolarization, we're already seeing that I see it in the classroom. I mean, they just don't like how extreme the responses are and how, the villainization of both sides goes.
One of the best things about teaching for me, I got into it much later than you. And I only started teaching as a kind of late career move, but being exposed, hanging out with young people and hearing what they have to say actually really keeps me optimistic.
Agreed. Yeah.
Some of the reasons you just expressed. So, yeah,
And
thanks again.
beyond politics, they just keep us on like current trends, right? So it forces you to stay younger, which I think is a good thing. Forces you to stay relevant. I'm not going to claim it forces me to stay cool or anything like that, but it definitely keeps me at least more in the know than I would be otherwise.
Yeah, teaching is very much, from my conversations with some of the older faculty who've actually retired by now, teaching now is much more interactive than it used to be. And, we're hearing a lot from our students, more than professors did maybe, when I was in college. And that's actually a wonderful thing.
Yeah,
So,
I agree.
anyway, thanks so much, Kristyn. I really appreciate it.